So happy to have this opportunity to speak at the IDA's annual parent conference. I will start with a brief overview of the status of our inquiry, and then we are going to, as mentioned earlier, hopefully run through the areas that the inquiry is addressing, and in the process, hopefully address some of your questions and concerns. So most of you will know that the Ontario Human Rights Commission launched a public inquiry into human rights issues affecting students with reading disabilities in October of 2019. The terms of reference for that inquiry are on our website, and I won't get into too much detail because I'm sure you're quite familiar, but the Commission used its powers under the Ontario Human Rights Code to request production of information, documents, and data from a representative sample of 8 of Ontario's English public and Catholic school boards and all 13 of Ontario's English public faculties of education. Overall, the school boards did a great job of cooperating and assisting us with our requests, particularly given the fact that they were dealing first with labor challenges, and then, of course, after COVID after we were dealing with COVID, they were dealing with the challenge of providing continuity of learning during school closures. We received the first round of school board production by about the end of June last year. We completed a preliminary review of the extensive materials that we received, and we met with each school board. And following up on that, we identified other areas that we wanted further information and documentation. And so we began an ongoing process of reaching out to the school boards, asking for more information. And we've been receiving that information on a rolling basis until quite recently. We also requested all of the 13 English language public faculties of education provide us with their course outline, syllabi, reading list, and other materials related to a whole range of issues connected to this inquiry, but most notably how they are preparing their pre-service Bachelor of Education candidates and also in-service teachers who are taking additional qualification courses, how they're preparing them to understand how kids learn to read and how to teach kids to read, as well as how to support students who are struggling to learn to read. We did have some delays, but we received all the faculty of education material by about April of last year. You'll also know that our inquiry included significant public engagement to hear from people with lived experience and other expertise. So we had 8 main ways to get information from the public. We had 4 public hearings, and if you didn't attend one, you can go back and view them on YouTube. We had a community meeting in Kenora, which was unfortunately the only community meeting we were able to hold before we had to stop holding meetings due to COVID. We had a number of engagements with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities and organizations. We had our parent-student survey, and we received about 1,400 completed surveys. We had an educator and other professional survey, which we actually received a very high response on that as well. We received 1,700 surveys. Many organizations like IDA, Decoding Dyslexia, and others submitted submissions. We reached out for student artwork and poetry. We asked students to express in various forms what the right to read means to them, and we're going to be excited to show some of that work in our report. We also had a lot of people connect with us through our legal email inbox and through leaving voicemails and us calling back and speaking with people. And we also conducted a number of one-on-one interviews where there were gaps or information that we needed to fill in. There has been a significant amount of research that has been undertaken as part of this inquiry. We're obviously looking at best practices from other jurisdictions, as well as looking into the body of scientific research on how children learn to read and the impacts of failing to teach children how to read. We initially started off working with one expert, Dr. Linda Siegel, who is an international authority on reading disabilities. But once we realized what the significant volume of material we were dealing with and the very broad scope of the inquiry, we identified the need to bring on a second expert. So we retained Dr. Jamie Metzala, who is a professor of education and the Gail Stephen Jaroslawski Chair in Learning Disabilities at Mount St. Vincent University in Halifax. And she's been working with us on this inquiry since late October. So now we have 2 experts that we are working with. We have encountered some challenges. So, you know, I talked a little bit about the COVID challenges that boards face, but we too, as an organization, faced our own challenges related to COVID, related to our own internal resources that we were able to dedicate, waiting on receiving production from others who were delayed because of dealing with COVID, and our inability to hold some of the public engagements we'd hoped to have. We also, the volume of materials that we've had to receive and analyze has been very challenging. It's been very helpful to have a second expert. So as a result, on last Friday, we provided an update on our website that our report won't be out now until the fall. However, we do want to assure you that in the meantime, we are continuing to engage with education sector and other stakeholders. It's been quite significant that our Chief Commissioner has met with Minister Lecce, and we have also had numerous meetings with senior Ministry of Education officials, and we are well on our way to sharing with them our preliminary findings and recommendations, and urging them to take action as quickly as possible, even before the final report comes out. And so far, they have been very receptive. And we are planning to continue to engage with them and other stakeholders to lay the groundwork for action for when our report does come out. Today, we're going to share some of our tentative findings and potential recommendations with you. The report, though well on its way to being finalized, is not finalized. It has not gone through a full approval process, but we think it's really important to be transparent and give you information about where things are headed. And we don't anticipate that things would change significantly from what we will present to you today. Alicia, I'm going to turn it over to you now, and I believe you have some questions you want to ask us.
Yes, I do. Thank you very much. And I just want to, again, thank you and Nika both for joining us today. And thank you to everybody who's here for submitting your questions during the registration process. So we had a lot of fantastic questions. And what we've done is we sort of took the questions and we grouped them and selected themes so that we could make sure we covered as much as possible this evening. So based on those, I'm going to ask Rina and Nika some questions. So the first one is, that we had a lot of questions that came in about broader issues of equity. And people were wondering exactly how are you looking at intersectionality and those broader issues of equity within the scope of the inquiry? And to what extent are you looking into those issues?
Thanks, Alicia. So the report will address systemic issues that affect many students who struggle to learn to read. We will be looking at intersectional issues affecting students with other disabilities, First Nations, Métis, Inuit students, racialized students, newcomers, English language learners, students from lower income families, as well as students living in rural areas, remote areas in the north. So the report will address how these intersections compound the existing disadvantage associated with having dyslexia and it not being addressed by the school system. So some of these trends are more pronounced for students from these code protected groups that I listed earlier, such as the lack of access or delayed access to evidence-based interventions, or an educational culture that promotes low expectations and assumptions about student potential. So just briefly to provide you with an overview of some of those intersections, with respect to students with other disabilities, the OHRC heard that students with other disabilities such as intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, hearing disabilities, vision disabilities, autism spectrum disorder, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder face many of the same barriers as students with dyslexia. And we hope that they will also benefit from the report's recommendations in that vein. In terms of geography, we heard about the huge variability in terms of what is offered in schools based on where people live. And that's even more clear when it comes to students who live in more rural or remote areas. This is even more concerning because we know that there is a lack of evidence-based supports outside of the school. So tutoring, interventions, professional assessments, assuming that families can afford those private services. And if those private supports are available, then they're more costly and or require more traveling time. And sometimes factors are prohibitive. When it comes to income, the report will address inequities that are created when the school system does not teach students to read, when schools fail to provide interventions and supports and provide timely access to board assessments when needed. This is all the more troubling when we know that there are limited school spots sometimes often actually for evidence-based reading interventions, or when school boards make psychoed assessments a prerequisite for accessing school supports, including reading interventions. So parents who have money are able to supplement what the school provides while those who do not have money cannot. When it comes to racialized students, and particularly Black students, the inquiry report will address those experiences of students with reading disabilities and the unique challenges that we heard about related to institutionalized racism. So these students face additional barriers such as being streamed disproportionately into applied courses and special education classes. For First Nation, Métis, Inuit students, there will be a section of the report dedicated to addressing findings and recommendations, which will actually be informed by the specific engagements that we held with those distinct communities over the course of the inquiry. So that section will address those distinct challenges respectively, and how the legacy of colonialism continues to impact the experiences of First Nation, Métis, Inuit students with reading difficulties. We've heard that there are delays for identifying students for reading difficulties across populations, but this is even more true for English language learner students. The report will address some of the false assumptions about these students. And even though ELL students should receive interventions and be assessed for difficulties as soon as the need arises, we know that this is not always the case. When it comes to French immersion, the report will also address the experience of students in French immersion and how many students with dyslexia are actually streamed out of French immersion schools. And finally, with respect to the experience of Franco-Ontarians, we have received a number of surveys from students and families in French language school boards. Consistently, parents and students talked about the lack of supports in French. And although a French language school board was not part of our 8 targeted schools for the inquiry, the findings and recommendations will be equally applicable to the French language school boards. So we are hopeful that our recommendations will respond to the systemic issues for many students, and that students and families with different intersecting identities will be able to see themselves in the report.
Thank you. We also had quite a lot of questions regarding reading instruction and the curriculum, specifically the kindergarten program, the language curriculum, and reading instruction in general right across the board, as well as a lot of questions about exactly what you're looking into in terms of teacher training. Could you speak to that?
Yes. So the inquiry is considering the kindergarten program and Ontario's language curriculum. Our experts have reviewed and provided their opinions on both. We know that those documents are of central importance. School boards, clearly, they're required to follow the curriculum, and faculties of education are both required to prepare teachers to teach the curriculum. And we definitely noted from our review of their materials, and also we were able to speak with some folks that the curriculum is the central focus. So we absolutely know that the curriculum is driving much of what's happening in Ontario, and that is actually a very central and primary focus of the inquiry. We've also considered school boards' implementation of the curriculum based on what they provided to us and told us, but also parent and educator survey results. So we've reviewed all of that in relation to what the scientific evidence tells us. And we know that decades and decades of hundreds of thousands of scientific research papers and other forms of evidence has shown that explicit and systematic instruction starting in kindergarten in foundational skills such as phonological awareness and importantly phonemic awareness and phonics and how to use these to decode words, which I can also call it structured literacy because it's a little bit easier than saying all of that. We know that the scientific research has shown that using those approaches is essential for students with dyslexia, but it's also good for all students. But yet in Ontario, we have a curriculum that uses the 3 cueing system. We have a very heavy focus by boards on either balanced literacy or comprehensive balanced literacy, both of which are whole language derivatives or based on whole language philosophies, and do not promote the direct and systematic teaching of phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, phonics, and how to use these to decode words. So we have a real issue in that we have a curriculum and instructional approaches that do not appear to be, well, we'd go stronger to say are not consistent with what science shows us works. So that's a significant concern. And we certainly will be making findings and recommendations related to that. Of course, we're all familiar with the critical role that teachers play in teaching children and preventing reading failure. We've seen it in numerous reports out of the National Reading Panel report in the United States, the Rose reports in England. The IDA, of course, has done so much work on teacher preparation, and Dr. Louisa Moats has done a lot of work as well, and most recently produced an excellent paper called Teaching Reading as Rocket Science, 2020, What Expert Teachers of Reading Should Know and Be Able to Do. So we know that teachers need to be given the tools and the supports to teach reading properly. And yet we consistently heard from parents, students, and even many teachers who completed our educator survey that they're not adequately prepared to teach reading, even when they've taken reading specialist AQs, including the reading 1, reading 2, and the reading specialist. So even when they've done that really in-depth training, many teachers still reported not feeling they have been prepared to teach reading generally, but struggling readers in particular. As I mentioned, we did obtain the syllabi, reading lists, and materials from the 13 English language faculties of education, both for their Bachelor of Education courses and their additional qualification courses. And we do have concerns about how pre and in-service teachers are being prepared to teach reading and understand and respond to the needs of students with dyslexia. We are concerned that they're learning very little about how skilled reading develops, including the role of word reading for reading comprehension. Like the curriculum, the teachers are mostly just being prepared to promote guessing strategies from context cues and are learning little about the importance of early screening and how to screen. So instead of focusing on phonics screens, they're learning a lot about how to do running records and miscue analyses, which we know are not good tools to be using to assess reading skills. And they're not learning how to respond to struggling readers with effective interventions. And the concern is that this lack of knowledge not only prevents teachers from delivering good quality instruction that we know can prevent issues in so many students, but it can actually lead to some harmful stereotypes that can result in negative outcomes for students. So many of you might have heard teachers say, don't worry, your child will, it's fine for a child to be behind, they'll catch up, or it's normal for boys to take longer than girls to learn to read, and all of this just delays interventions because teachers think that it's developmentally appropriate for kids to not learn how to read. And in fact, that's not the case. The sooner kids are identified and responses provided, the better. And we've also heard about teachers telling parents, well, you just need to read to your kids more, as though exposure to more books is the solution. So there are definitely areas for improvement, and we will be making recommendations about the Ontario curriculum, instructional guides, how teachers should be trained, and what types of resources should and should not be used in aid of that.
Thank you. That dovetails really nicely into the next question that I have, and that is about identification, early identification. So we had a lot of questions about screening and early identification, and I was just wondering if you're able to comment at all on what you're seeing in the boards and what boards are doing in terms of early intervention of struggling readers or children at risk of dyslexia.
Mm-hmm. So we know that universal early screening is important to identify and address the needs of students who are at risk for failing to learn to read, and to ensure that they receive timely and needed intervention. So we anticipate that the inquiry findings will actually confirm that we don't have such a system, that screening isn't systematic, evidence-based, or early in Ontario. Every board that we spoke to raised challenges associated with PPM 155, and the fact that this PPM says diagnostic assessment should be based on teachers' professional judgment in terms of who to screen, when to screen, how frequently to screen. And boards are concerned that they have lost their ability to require that every student be screened using one consistent screening tool in specific grades and at particular times of the year. So another concern with the PPM is that it prevents boards from actually collecting data centrally. And they used to rely on that, or they can see the potential of relying on that to identify areas of need and to program and plan. So as a result, what we are actually seeing is that the approach to screening is very ad hoc. It varies widely between boards and between teachers in the same board or even school. And we are concerned that that PPM has led to gaps, inconsistencies, and a lack of an effective student-centered approach to early screening. And there's also a concern about whether the screening instruments are actually evidence-based and valid and reliable and all that good stuff. So we anticipate recommending that the ministry and boards, it's PPM 155. Okay, great. Somebody in the chat. I guess I can rely on other people. There's 120 other people who can answer that. So we anticipate recommending that the ministry and boards mandate and standardize the use of universal evidence-based screening instruments for all students, starting in kindergarten to grade 2, and that they identify screening instruments that can be used for all students, but with measures that are appropriate for each grade level and time. So most importantly, evidence-based interventions must be provided immediately based on screening results, because why else screen if it doesn't lead to action? And in this case, data-informed action is also important. So we anticipate also making a recommendation related to data collection with respect to screening, as well as progress monitoring. So those are just some preliminary points of what we've been finding and what we anticipate recommending with respect to screening.
Thanks. We also had quite a lot of questions about accommodations. A lot of parents often are telling us that, we have accommodations on the IEP, but how do we ensure that they're actually being implemented? So the question is, will the inquiry address the role of accommodations and how to make sure that accommodations that are in place on the IEP are in fact implemented?
That's mine. we're alternating. Yeah, I mean, the inquiry heard a lot of concerns with accommodations too, both in terms of the quality of accommodation and concerns with actual, whether they're being provided at all or consistently, but also We heard that accommodation is often being used instead of teaching children to read. So it's often a solution for a struggling reader to give them assistive technology when really very little effort has been made to actually ensure that the student can read. So that is something that we will have to intend to be very clear about in the report, that accommodation has a role, but it's not a substitute for high quality science-based instruction, for early screening, or for evidence-based intervention. So I think that message has to be sent very clearly. In terms of when accommodation is appropriate and needed, we did hear that accommodation is inconsistently provided, either across classes or across grades. Sometimes it's only available for EQAO testing and not for being able to access the curriculum and for students to demonstrate what their knowledge of the curriculum. Huge concerns with placing the onus on a parent or even a student, sometimes students as young as 6 or 7, to have to advocate to get accommodations. That's concerning from an equity standpoint. Not every parent is in the same place to be able to know that they can ask for things and know how to approach it, or to be a strong advocate. And when it's just simply inappropriate to expect a young child to have to self-advocate. It's just not a skill that's developed in younger students. And why should a child have to the child who doesn't need accommodation isn't there having to advocate to just be taught how to read, for example. It's just expected that the teachers will do that. So why should other children have to self-advocate to have their needs be met? We will address the stigma and the lack of training that may prevent students from using accommodations. We definitely heard a lot about students not being able, when they do need to use assistive technology, not either having the training to do it, or finding it really hard or stigmatizing to do it in a classroom setting. We definitely heard about teachers not knowing enough about accommodations, so that they're either resistant to it or just aren't able to help students with it. And that's something we're going to be addressing. Another issue that came out very strongly in the inquiry is that it's not uncommon for schools to modify curriculum expectations to those from a lower grade level, rather than provide quality instruction, evidence-based intervention, and accommodation. And often without enough consideration given to how this is going to affect a student's future academic pathways, or even their career options when they get to high school and find out that they can only take applied or locally developed courses because they have been on a modified curriculum. So we do anticipate making strong recommendations about the use of modifications for students with dyslexia, and strongly discouraging that as a practice.
That's great, thank you. And I like that you focused on the need to ensure that children are getting the instruction that they need to learn how to read, rather than just being given modifications or accommodations. So we had quite a lot of questions as well about intervention, of course. And I wonder if you can tell us what you've learned so far about the interventions that are being offered across the province.
So evidence-based instruction, screening all students, and providing evidence-based instruction in a more intensive, smaller setting when necessary will reduce the number of students who require more intensive tier 2 or tier 3 interventions. However, it's important, this is the key point, that those interventions be evidence-based and age-appropriate for students who are not responding well to instruction in the classroom. So what do we think the findings will say? Well, we anticipate the findings will be that there are limited evidence-based interventions available to students currently. The access to reading interventions varies dramatically by board. So there are actually many different programs being used and at different grades inconsistently. Many boards are actually treating reading interventions as more of the same, but in a smaller group setting. But this won't actually work for students with dyslexia, or is not working for students with dyslexia. And some of those interventions are actually not supported by science. But some boards are heavily invested in those reading interventions that we anticipate, or experts will say, are not evidence-based programs. So where there are actually better programs that are being used, it may be too little, too late, in the sense that there's not enough spots for all students who need them, or they're being delivered in grade 4 to 6 when there was no prior earlier intervention, or there may be issues with delivery. So the full suite of programming is not given, lack of training. So the issue with providing them too late is the effectiveness is greatly reduced. There's also an issue of if the curriculum is promoting a different approach, not based on the science of reading, then the issue is that the classroom approach is not reinforcing learning from these evidence-based interventions and actually confusing students. So in terms of what needs to happen, there needs to be greater availability of these evidence-based interventions and easier access. And psychoeducational assessments should not be required to receive these interventions. There also needs to be tracking of the effectiveness of different interventions that school boards are using, which is not really happening. So the two main areas of recommendations we anticipate making relate to recommending that school boards stop using non-evidence-based interventions, and then the ministry to develop a list of standardized evidence-based reading interventions with appropriate eligibility criteria, and then requiring all boards to have these interventions available to all students who require them.
Thanks. Yeah, in your answer, you briefly touched on psychoeducational assessments sometimes being required for students to access intervention programs. And I know that that was one of the things the inquiry is looking into, is the role of psychoeducational and other professional assessments. Can you speak a little bit more to what you've been finding in regards to that?
Yeah, so professional assessment should not be a requirement for accessing accommodations or interventions. We asked all the school boards if they were, and all but one said they don't require an assessment to access reading interventions and accommodations, but one board did say they require, and they call it a learning disability diagnosis because that's a whole other issue, but they require a learning disability diagnosis to access tier 3 reading interventions, so their most intensive ones, and that is a concern. So, and even though school boards told us they didn't require these assessments, in practice, many parents described that having an assessment is what helps them get an accommodation or intervention for their child. So the reality is that while there may be, most boards may not have an official position that this is a requirement, the reality may be quite different. So that puts parents who can pay for private assessments potentially in a better position to get services for their child, because the inquiry also considered how long it takes to get a board assessment and what the criteria are to get an assessment through the school board. And it won't surprise people to hear that there are long wait lists for board assessments. There is a lack of consistency in approaches to deciding who will be referred to an assessment, and there are criteria that may be problematic. So many boards are taking the position that a child needs to be in at least grade 3 before they'll even be considered to be put on a waiting list to potentially wait a couple of years to get an assessment. Sometimes there's a criteria that the child needs to be a certain number of grade levels behind in their reading. In children who have concurrent disabilities or have behavioral challenges may get priority because, again, rationing of limited resources, boards may put those children at the top of the list. So it really is inconsistent in terms of how schools and boards are managing their assessments and what the criteria are for prioritizing students. A lot of boards do not maintain central waiting lists, despite the fact that the Auditor General several years ago recommended that there be central waiting lists. So there are definitely issues with access to board funding assessments. We really are wanting to emphasize that if all the other things that need to happen, so science-based reading instruction, proper early screening that can identify students who are at risk, and immediate early intervention using tiered approaches where you increase the level of intensity depending on whether the child is responding. You're going to need many fewer psychoeducational assessments. There will be fewer kids who are not responding after a period of intensive science-based interventions who need to be referred for an assessment. But even while they're waiting, supports still need to be provided. So interventions and, if necessary, accommodations should be being provided even while a student is waiting. And the goal is to get students identified early. It's really heartbreaking when you hear that it's not until grade 6, 7, 8 that kids are being picked up, because we all know that that's missing a critical window of opportunity to get in there and intervene. We're also going to be looking at whether a referral for a psychoeducational assessment requires a full battery of ability and cognitive processing tests, like IQ tests. IQ tests don't actually predict whether a student will respond to reading interventions, and they have been shown to be culturally biased.
Thanks, Rima. So now I think the big question, and I just want to say as well that the last couple of answers I think has been very exciting. A lot of people in the chat are very happy to hear you saying these things. Like, I feel like you've definitely heard what parents have been saying and got the message loud and clear, which is fantastic. But my next question is kind of the big question. So what happens after the findings of the inquiry come out? What happens? What happens next?
I feel like that's an important question. I think there's been a couple questions that kind of get at that in the comments. So we, as Rima said earlier, we have already started engaging with key stakeholders, and we will continue to do so even prior to the launch of the report. And as our website update has said, the Chief Commissioner has met with the Minister of Education to discuss these issues and potential recommendations stemming from the inquiry. They are following it quite carefully, and we also continue to have discussions with the senior level staff. And we've shared information about our research, what we've been learning, and we're going to keep encouraging them to proactively begin to address the concerns arising out of the inquiry. So we are looking forward to seeing them implement our recommendations, and hopefully we will start to see actions soon, because we believe we can make change. We consider use of our inquiry powers to actually be very significant and consistent with our enforcement mandate, but we also have other enforcement powers under the code. For example, the OHRC has the power to initiate an application before the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, which is the administrative body that hears human rights complaints. But in essence, the OHRC's intention is to ensure that the report doesn't just get shelved, and we will consider using all of our powers to ensure that the rights of students are met. We do have a long tradition of working with the government in other areas as well, and continuing to advocate to make sure recommendations become reality. So in other words, we are looking for action, and we will use the report as a vehicle to achieve the desired outcome, which is to increase the opportunity for students to learn to read.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd say as well that I've seen in our organization the effects of the inquiry already. We've seen quite a bit more engagement and interest from school boards just coming to us for information, which is amazing to see as well. And I don't think that would be happening necessarily if it wasn't for the inquiry. So thank you very much for that. And finally, I want to ask, before we go to some of the questions from the chat today, sort of the last theme of questions that came in the pre-registration questions were about what do you do to advocate for your child if you feel like their rights are not being met. So I think a lot of the parents that are here on the call today kind of are at the point where we know what our rights are, but we are struggling sometimes to have those rights realized in school. So what advice do you have for parents in advocating at school?
Yeah, that is a very tough one, because I can't sit here and say, oh, well, you just have to do X and then everything will be fine and your child's needs will be met. It is a challenge. And it's in fact one of the reasons we launched this inquiry, because we know how difficult it is for parents to have to advocate on an individual basis, and how challenging the education system is, and then even how challenging the human rights system is if people are having to resort to that. So I can't sit here and say to you, oh, you just need to do X and Y and Z and it'll be fine. This is precisely why one of the main reasons we launched the inquiry is because we don't think it's okay that there are tens of thousands of parents around the province having to have these fights on a daily basis and then still really not get very much, have to be satisfied with, okay, I got a laptop for my child when they really should be getting taught to read. So I apologize. What I'm about to tell you isn't really all that wonderful, but I'm hoping that our report will really help you with your advocacy, because you will have something that you can take and to the teacher first, and then the administrators and whoever else, if you need to escalate it up the system, and crack it open and say, here the commission says this, and here the commission says that, and that will hopefully be helpful. We are exploring releasing a toolkit specific to how you can advocate your rights, your child's rights, and how you can advocate sometime after the report comes out. In the meantime, we do have our policy and guidelines on accessible education. If some school boards will say, okay, thanks, but when we can't do it, we don't have the resources, but you can certainly try to use what has been written and advocate for change that way. Our policies have some weight. So if the commission publishes a policy on a rights issue, and then say there's a case at the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario and somebody asks the tribunal to apply our policy, the tribunal actually has to consider how our policy applies to the circumstances. So they do have some legal weight behind them. There are legal clinics you can contact. So there's Arch Disability Law Center that deals with disability rights issues. There's Justice for Children and Youth that deal with advocacy on behalf of children and youth. And there's the Human Rights Legal Support Center. So how our human rights system in Ontario works is that there are what we call 3 pillars to the system. There's the Ontario Human Rights Commission. We do not deal with individual claims of discrimination. We do systemic inquiries and develop policies and do campaigns of public education. Then there's the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. That is the decision-making body that you can bring a human rights case to, and they will hear the case and they will make a decision, and they can issue binding orders related to that decision. So if they find that your child experienced discrimination, they can issue orders to schools to either stop doing the discrimination or to provide compensation. And then the third pillar in the human rights system is the Human Rights Legal Support Center. And they are what is effectively a free legal clinic that can provide legal advice and sometimes representation if you end up having to file a case at the tribunal. So you can reach out to these advocacy and legal organizations and see if they can support you. Sometimes it just takes, we heard lots of parents tell us that they were told no, 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 and then they just got a lawyer to write a letter or a clinic to contact the school, and then they got something put into place for the child. So it's a sad situation, but sometimes the squeaky wheel does get the oil. So if you can bring in an advocate, sometimes that does work. Worst case scenario, if you have to go to If you seek to enforce your rights through the human rights system, then what you would do is you would file an application with the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, which you could do on your own, or if you get a lawyer through that Human Rights Legal Support Center or another a legal clinic or a private lawyer, they can help you as well. If you go to the tribunal, you could potentially have a mediation and receive a settlement that could resolve your concerns, or if that doesn't happen, you could have a hearing, in which case the tribunal will consider whether your child has experienced discrimination, and what they'd be looking at is whether the school board failed to provide what was necessary for your child to have a meaningful access to education. If you are successful at the tribunal, there have, many of you will have heard of the Jeffrey Moore case out of British Columbia, which was a student with dyslexia. Jeffrey Moore had severe dyslexia and was able to show that when the school board closed down a school that provided intensive remediation for students like Jeffrey and put into place some other forms of accommodation that weren't sufficient to meet Jeffrey's needs and actually provide him with a meaningful access to education, that the school board discriminated against Jeffrey Moore. And the Moores had actually pulled Jeffrey out of the public system because it was failing him so badly and put him into a private school. And they were able to get reimbursed for the cost of his private school tuition. And there have been decisions in Ontario, one that just actually came out quite recently, that confirmed that where private services are the only reasonable alternative, because the school board is not providing meaningful access to education, then the tribunal can order parents to be reimbursed for those private services. So we do have a system in Ontario where, as a last resort, you can go and file a claim of discrimination, but hopefully it doesn't come to that, and you can use a lot of try to advocate within the system without it having to come to filing a human rights case.
Great. Rima, I'm just going to jump in. Some of the questions, you've probably seen them in the chat coming through. There was one about, how do we make sure there's a real change and not just change in name? For example, let's say that a board, hypothetically the TDSB, uses 3 queuing running records and adds on Kilpatrick's past for intervention, and then calls that structured literacy and tells the parents they're doing structured literacy.
Sorry, are you saying if the curriculum doesn't change or does change?
If it does change, how do we, I guess the question is, how is it ensured that it's actually changing and not just being just not in name, but in actual practice?
Well, teachers are required to follow the Ontario curriculum in its current form, and I'm not suggesting it in any way, shape, or form people should be reporting teachers to the Teachers College. But that is their professional obligation, actually, is to follow the curriculum. If a board were telling teachers not to follow the curriculum, that could be very problematic. So I mean, short of sitting in the classroom and watching what a teacher's doing, I don't know that it's possible for a parent to monitor. If it were to come to light that something like that were happening, certainly, you could raise that with the board and say, why aren't you following the curriculum, assuming the curriculum changes.
Thank you. Alicia, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
I did, yeah. I just realized that so many of the things that we're talking about here just come back to, and this was in the chat questions as well, come back to just an issue of general accountability. So will that be a focus of the report as well? The structures to ensure accountability for kids?
Yes, I think that is a big issue right now. We have a situation where other than the curriculum, a lot of discretion is left to boards to decide how they want to approach things. So there's very little requirement, for example, for data collection. We haven't even really touched on data collection, but there's really little boards are really required to collect very little data, and there's a lot that they don't track, and that's a concern. So we are definitely looking at some of those big picture systemic issues, like our standards being set so that we can have consistency across the province, and it's not a situation, we heard about parents moving so that they could get a service that a different board provided, or using an address so that they could get a service that a different, that shouldn't happen in Ontario. You should be guaranteed roughly the same level of services no matter where you live. And the service is supposed to be getting provided. There should be some mechanism. So yes, it's definitely something that we are looking into as part of the inquiry, is what at a system-wide level can be done to make sure things are being done, and someone's checking to make sure that they're being done.
Great, thanks. I know we have a few more questions, but I am just keeping an eye on the clock. I'm wondering if Rima and Nika, you could take one or two more questions before we hop into our breakout rooms. Are you okay with that?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. Nika, there was a question directed towards you about, you had mentioned that you're collecting data from stakeholders when it comes to the report. This particular participant says, however, I represented one of the few organizations in Ontario that represent racialized students. And up to this point, we haven't heard from anyone in terms of this report, including the government. I'm just wondering if you could speak to that.
Sure. So last year is kind of the stage we were at in terms of public outreach. We had kind of done a call for submissions from organizations, but we absolutely recognize that that didn't reach everybody that it should have. And throughout the inquiry, we've been looking at those submissions, and we've heard from different disability groups, different professional organizations, and that's the information that we will be incorporating into the report. So I did actually respond to this person privately too, and just said that I would take her contact information and take it back to the team. But yes, last year is when we kind of did our big call out to organizations for some submissions. Unfortunately, it would be great to continue collecting data and continuing to engage, but at some point too, we do have to write the report so that it can start doing the change that we're talking about as well too. But yes, it's something that we definitely want to reflect all the voices and all the communities in the report.
Thank you. And the last question we're just going to post or ask tonight before we break out is, what about accountability for faculties of education, in that they need to keep up with the science and teach according to the science and not according to beliefs? So will there be accountability and mention with the faculty of education?
I mean, what do you mean by accountability? Will the report be addressing their role in this and what they should be doing? Yes, that it will be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. That's super. I will just pause now. I want to take a moment to thank Nika and Rima for their informative and thorough presentation and so many questions answered tonight. I hope that everybody has got a few of their questions answered that they were looking for.